Okay, so this is part two, chemical bonding. So we're looking at Roman number two in your outline. There are different kinds of bonds. These are ways that two atoms stay together. And of the three subatomic particles, we talked about how electrons are the first to come into contact when two atoms move close together, and electrons are in fact involved in chemical bonding. And it's the number of electrons that dictates how atoms behave in chemical bonds, like what other atoms they bond with, what they do not bond with. So electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom in a very specific electron shells. So these shells are the clouds. For simplicity's sake, we just look at the atom like this, right? Remember, it's more complicated than this. But the very innermost shell only holds 2 electrons. So it's a small shell. You can think of it as like a little seat, right? It's a two-seater. Then this second shell holds 8. The third shell also holds 8, and the last shell holds 2. So we're only going to concern ourselves with the first 2 shells in any problems that you'll be working. And for lab, you'll have some activities that work with bonding. So let's take a look at what kind of bonds we have. I just also want to make sure you know that once a shell is filled up with 2 electrons, then you start filling the outermost shell. And then once this outermost shell has 8 electrons, then you start filling the third shell. So you go in order of the shells. And the atoms always like to have a full shell. If it's not full, so if this outer shell here only had 6 electrons in it, then it would want to bond with another atom to give it 2 more electrons, because that's the goal of bonding, is to reach this full shell of electrons. The atoms are happiest when they have a full outermost shell. Okay? So let's take a look at our first example here. So this is just reinforcing what we talked about. So hydrogen has atomic number 1. It has 1 proton, 1 electron, right? Remember, if it's neutral, it has 1 of each. It has an empty shell. So in this very first shell, it's supposed to hold 2 electrons. So it has an empty electron, right? It only has 1. So it wants to chemically bond with something else that will help it give it 1 more electron here. So hydrogen is going to want to make a bond. For carbon, carbon has 6, right? So our yellow dots here are the electrons. So 1, 2, right? Those are filled the innermost shell. And then we have 4 more. So the outer shell has 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons. Now look, there's 4 empty spots, right? So electrons like to fill the shells in twos. So I always like to think of this as a bus seat. A bus seat, like your school bus, holds 2 people. If you get on a bus, you're going to sit alone in a seat, right? If you get the next person gets on the bus, they're not going to sit with you, they're going to sit alone. And you're going to fill these 2-seaters until the next person comes on. They're going to have to sit with somebody else. So that's the way electrons fill their shell. They fill in 1 seat at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then if there's more electrons in that outer shell, then they'll start doubling up. Okay? So if you look at nitrogen, which has 7, so 7 protons, 7 electrons, 1, 2 in the innermost shell. The outermost then has 5, right? So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have the 2-seater now with 2, and then we have an empty chair next to the sky one. So we have 3 spots. We have 3 empty spots. So nitrogen wants to form a bond that will give it 3 electrons, because again, all atoms like to have a nice full outer shell. Oxygen has 8 electrons. And so we can see that if we look at nitrogen, we just fill another one. So here's another one filled. And so it has 2 empty spots. It's going to want to make 2 bonds that will help it fill those 2 electron seats. Okay? So the first kind of bond we're going to talk about is called an ionic bond. And this is where opposite charges attract. So this is the typical example of ionic bonds is salt. So sodium and chloride, when they come close, this is the example, when they come close together, so this is a little bit of chemistry, but you won't need to, this is just for your understanding. Here's chlorine. I'm sorry, this is sodium and this is chlorine. Chlorine only has one empty seat in its outermost shell. So the need or the want to fill that seat is very, very high. If it only has one, it's very powerful and can pull an electron. This guy, poor guy, the sodium, only has one electron in the outermost shell, so it's not really held on tightly. This outermost shell, this guy can pop off pretty easily. So that's what happens when the need or the pull for an electron is very strong next to an atom that, can actually lose this electron very easily. That's what happens. So when this chemical transfer, when the electron gets transferred over or stolen, then we're left with sodium here with a positive charge. It becomes a cation, and then chlorine has picked up an electron, so it has a negative charge. It's an anion, and because now they have opposite charges, they like to stay together. So that's an ionic bond. An ionic bond means that the opposite charges on these different atoms causes them to stay together, but it's also, the other thing you want to remember with ionic bonds is that the electron completely is stolen from one atom and taken into by the other atom. Okay. So ionic compounds are held together by ionic bonds. So salt is an ionic compound. Okay. So let's talk about the different one called a covalent bond. So I have draw an example, and this is kind of the thing that I would draw on the board with you guys in class. So two molecules share your outer electrons. So when you have a covalent bond, it's not this anymore. It's not where chlorine just steals the electron. Now we're going to share the electrons equally. Well, how do you do that? So let me just show you this moving GIF because this is kind of a nice way to think about it. So those red dots represent electrons. And the electrons are orbiting the oxygen, but they're also coming around and orbiting the hydrogen. So these electrons are being shared between oxygen and hydrogen. And it keeps oxygen and hydrogen together because those electrons are shared in their orbits. So when you're sharing electrons, that is a covalent bond. Okay? So molecules are sharing their outer electrons. These bonds are the strongest of all because your orbits are overlapping, and it's, I guess it's just something to remember that the covalent bonds are the strongest bonds. Hard to break covalent bonds. Now, sharing can be equal or unequal, okay? Just like anything in life, if you are sharing something with your sister, you're not really equally sharing a pair of shoes. Someone's wearing those shoes more. So a non-polar covalent bond, you can see here, is equal sharing. So if the electrons are spending the same amount of time around these two atoms, then you can see the cloud of electrons is very even and equal. That's called a non-polar covalent bond. Now, a polar covalent bond is unequal sharing. So you can see chlorine here is a little bit larger. It's getting more of those electrons around it more often, and the hydrogen gets some, but not all the time. So the polar covalent bond is an unequal sharing, and the atom that hogs the electrons is called electronegative. So electronegativity refers to describing an atom that pulls the electrons towards it. Okay? So let's take a look at another water, because we're going to talk about water a lot. Water is H2O. Oxygen is the electronegative atom here, and it's going to hog or attract the shared electrons more. So in this picture, we can see the electron cloud is much bigger around oxygen because oxygen is electronegative. It hogs the electrons. So this is a polar covalent bond. In water, water is H2O. Here is our O, here's our oxygen, and these are the two hydrogens. These are the H2. Because the electrons are going to be hovering around the oxygen more, and the electrons have a negative charge, that gives the oxygen a slightly negative charge, right? Just because it has more negative charge around it more often. But what that leaves hydrogen is with a partial positive charge. Okay, hopefully you understand this, right? Because if hydrogen's losing the electron most of the time around oxygen, it's going to have most of the time a positive charge on it. So our two hydrogens are ending up with not a full positive charge, it's a partial positive charge because we're not losing the electron, we're just sharing it unequally. So the hydrogens have a partial positive charge, oxygen has a partial negative charge. These are polar covalent bonds between the oxygen and the hydrogen. Now, this molecule of water is said to be polar because anytime you have a charge difference, negative here, positive here, due to the fact that you have a polar covalent bond, this makes the entire molecule polar. So we say water is a polar molecule. Okay, this is going to be very important. And all that means, the polar molecule, all it means is that it has a charge, okay? Charges on it. If you had something like this, H2, there's no difference in the electron cloud. There's no charge difference. This would be a non-polar molecule, okay? This is a polar molecule, all right? Because chlorine is going to end up being negative and hydrogen is going to end up being positive. All right, let's move on. So I have an example for you guys to draw. You can draw this from your textbook or from the PowerPoint images I just did. I want to just take a look at the way that these covalent bonds are drawn and illustrated. So there is a single bond here. So a single bond, this line, shows me that they're sharing, these lines between atoms is always covalent, okay? So it shows me that there's one electron from one hydrogen that it's sharing with the other. This guy is sharing an electron, so there's two electrons being shared here, right? One electron from each atom. In a double bond, which is completely possible, oxygen is sharing two, and this oxygen is sharing two. So there's four. Right? So this is a double bond. Some instances, you can have a triple bond. It's not shown here, but you can have a triple bond, which would be three lines. Here's another way of looking at methane, CH4. So you have carbon here, and a hydrogen. There's four bonds with hydrogen, and I can see they're all single bonds, right? So these are different ways of looking at molecules. There's the electron configuration way. There's the structural formula. We'll talk about this. This is what you'll see most often, structural formulas. Space filling models that textbooks like, and then the ball and stick model that I haven't, you use this as models in the classroom, but in textbooks they usually use one of these two. Okay. So concept check. The reactive properties or chemical behavior of an atom mostly depends on the number of, and what's your answer? So pause it. Okay, so your answer is D, electrons in the outer electron shell of the atom, right? The inner electron shell, in this example, is filled, and this doesn't react because it's not the one that comes into contact first with another atom. It's the outermost shell, and the outermost shell, if it's missing an electron, it's going to be reactive. Okay. Hydrogen bonds, letter C. A hydrogen is positive of one molecule, and it is attracted to another molecule to a negative atom there. And this is a opposites attract, but it's between two different molecules. This is an example where you're looking at 5 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 water molecules. The oxygen is red, the hydrogens are white. So we can see that, remember I said water is a polar molecule. The hydrogens have a partial positive charge. The oxygens have a partial negative charge. And if you have a lot of water molecules, then when a hydrogen that's positive gets close to an oxygen that's negative, there's a electrical charge here, right? The difference in charges is going to have an attraction. So that's a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are relatively weak, okay? And it's defined basically a hydrogen atom bonds to an electronegative atom of another molecule. It keeps molecules together. So I asked you to draw hydrogen bonds between two water molecules. So you can choose this one in the middle and maybe this one here to draw. Okay, it's very important that you do these hand exercises. Don't just look at the screen because that's passive learning. You're going to forget as soon as you shut down your laptop. You want to be able to draw these things out. It really does help you remember. There's been research on this that if you write things down with your hand, not type it, but like literally write and draw, it helps you remember things better. So I want you guys to draw one of those out. Okay, so here's a concept check. Water molecules form hydrogen bonds because, so stop it, pause. Okay, your answer is the water molecule is polar. So why is this one wrong? Why is B wrong? The oxygen molecule is positively charged. That's wrong because oxygen is negative. The water molecule forms a tetrahedron. That's the shape. You can see the shape is like a Mickey Mouse. That's a tetrahedron. But that's not the reason why it forms hydrogen bonds. And the hydrogen atoms are negative, so that's wrong, right? Hydrogen atoms are positive charge. So A is the only one that makes sense. All right, so before we move on to water, I want to take a look at these terms, hydrophilic and hydrophobic. The word hydrophobic, right, phobias, actually your notes start with philic, so let's do philia. And in fact, hold on just a second. Okay, so what I did in that pause, I just made hydrophilic here and hydrophobic here, because Kool-Aid is an example of something that's hydrophilic, and oil and water is hydrophobic. Well, let me just explain. So hydrophilic, philia is to mean love, and phobic, phobias are fear. So hydro in both of those words means water. So hydrophilic means something that loves water. Hydrophobic means something that is afraid of water. What that really means is that hydrophilic substances dissolve in water. So Kool-Aid, for example, the sugar and the food coloring that's in that packet, both of those substances dissolve in water. So you can get a nice even mix of that Kool-Aid mix into a pitcher of water. I will say that the reason, you need to know this, okay, the reason why Kool-Aid is hydrophilic is because it's also polar. So the sugar that's inside is polar and the food coloring is polar. Remember I said water is polar? You have to remember this phrase, like dissolves like. So anything polar dissolves anything else that is also polar. Since water is polar, it dissolves anything else that has a charge on it, okay? And if you think about all the things that we dissolve in water, so many things in life are hydrophilic. Okay, so anything that can dissolve in water is hydrophilic. Now, hydrophobic is the opposite. Oil and water never mix, right? Oil, when you put oil in water, it will form a film. It does not dissolve and evenly mix in the water. It just stays away from water. That's because oil is non-polar. The chemical of oil, the fat, does not have a charge on it. And due to that small difference, it does not mix with water. Water doesn't like things that don't have a charge. So oil never mixes. It's hydrophobic. It is non-polar. Okay, again, Kool-Aid is polar. It dissolves in water. That's also polar. Oil is non-polar. It does not dissolve in water, which is polar. Okay, so keep that in mind. This video here, this lotus leaf video, I will put onto your module as something to watch about something that's hydrophobic. Okay.